The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Captain James Mitchell adjusted his red uniform for the third time. His hands trembled slightly, not from the London chill, but from the weight of what lay ahead. After 15 years of loyal service to the crown, he never imagined he would find himself in such an impossible position. James had grown up in a modest home in Yorkshire, where his father worked in the coal mines and his mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. The military had been his escape, his chance to serve something greater than himself. When he was selected for the Queen's Guard, his parents had cried tears of joy. Now, standing in the ornate hallway outside the throne room, those same tears felt like a distant memory. The trouble had started 3 weeks ago when Lord Pemberton, the Queen's chief advisor, had begun implementing new protocols. Pemberton was a man who commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. His cold gray eyes seemed to pierce through anyone who dared question his authority. The aristocrat had served the royal family for decades, climbing the ranks through careful political maneuvering and an unwavering dedication to tradition. James remembered the exact moment when everything changed. It was during the changing of the guard ceremony, a tradition that drew thousands of tourists daily. Pemberton had been escorting a group of foreign dignitaries when he noticed James standing at attention near the palace gates. Without warning, the advisor had stopped mid-conversation and pointed directly at the guard. "You there," Pemberton had called out, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of noble breeding. "Your posture is inadequate for someone representing Her Majesty. Kneel and show proper deference." The request had shocked everyone present. The foreign visitors had exchanged confused glances while tourists nearby began pulling out their phones to record what they assumed was part of some elaborate ceremony. James had felt his face burn with embarrassment, but training had taught him to follow orders without question. He had slowly lowered himself to one knee, his rifle held at the prescribed angle. The incident should have ended there, but Pemberton seemed to derive some twisted satisfaction from the display. Over the following days, he had begun singling out James during various palace functions, always finding some minor fault with his uniform or posture. Each time the punishment was the same: kneel before the assembled crowd. Other guards had begun to notice the pattern. Whispered conversations in the barracks revealed that James was not the first to be subjected to Pemberton's humiliation tactics. Several younger guards had already requested transfers to avoid similar treatment. The older soldiers spoke in hushed tones about how things had changed since the advisor's promotion to his current position. Margaret Thompson, a palace cook who had worked there for over 20 years, had watched these events unfold with growing concern. She had seen many advisors come and go, but none had shown such open contempt for the working staff. During her breaks, she would often chat with the guards, offering them homemade biscuits and a kind word. James had become one of her favorites, reminding her of her own son who served overseas. "It's not right what he's doing to you, love," Margaret had told James one afternoon as she handed him a cup of tea. "You're a good man and you don't deserve this treatment." James had simply nodded, unable to find words to express his frustration. He had considered filing a formal complaint, but the palace hierarchy was complex and unforgiving. Pemberton held considerable influence, and challenging him could mean the end of James's military career. With a wife and 2 young children at home, he could not afford to lose his position. The breaking point had come during a state dinner preparation. James had been assigned to security detail for the event, which would host several heads of state. The palace was bustling with activity, as staff prepared for what would be one of the most important diplomatic gatherings of the year. Every detail had to be perfect, from the flower arrangements to the positioning of each guard. Pemberton had been conducting a final inspection when he spotted James standing near the main entrance. The advisor's eyes had narrowed as he approached, and James had immediately straightened his already perfect posture. But it was not enough. It never was. "Your presence here is a disgrace to this institution," Pemberton had declared loudly, ensuring that nearby staff members could hear every word. "How dare you stand in the presence of royalty without showing proper respect? Kneel immediately and beg forgiveness for your insolence." This time something was different. James could see other staff members watching, their faces filled with sympathy and anger on his behalf. He could hear the whispered protests from fellow guards who had witnessed too many of these humiliating displays. Most importantly, he could see young Prince George approaching from the far end of the corridor. The prince, Barely 18 and recently returned from his studies abroad, had been observing palace life with fresh eyes. Unlike many royals who remained isolated from the daily operations of their household, George had made an effort to know the names and faces of those who served his family. He had noticed the tension surrounding James's treatment, but had not yet found an appropriate moment to intervene. As James slowly began to lower himself toward the marble floor, his mind raced with thoughts of his family, his career, and his dignity. The weight of his rifle felt heavier than usual, and the gold braiding on his uniform seemed to mock the humiliation he was about to endure. Around him, the palace continued its preparations for the evening's festivities. But for James, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Margaret watched from the kitchen doorway, her hands clenched into fists as she witnessed yet another display of Pemberton's cruelty. Several other staff members had gathered nearby, their usual chatter replaced by tense silence. Even the most seasoned palace employees who had witnessed decades of royal drama seemed shocked by the advisor's behavior. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge the very foundations of palace protocol and hierarchy. As James's knee approached the cold marble floor, none of those present could have predicted how dramatically the situation was about to change, or how one young prince's intervention would alter the course of multiple lives forever. Prince George's footsteps echoed through the grand corridor as he witnessed the scene unfolding before him. The young prince had always been taught that leadership meant more than wearing a crown or holding a title. His recent studies at Cambridge had exposed him to ideas about dignity, respect, and the responsibility that comes with privilege. Watching Captain Mitchell being forced to kneel filled him with a burning sense of injustice that he could no longer ignore. "Stop!" George's voice rang out clearly across the marble hallway. The single word carried more authority than any of the assembled staff had ever heard from the young royal. Lord Pemberton froze mid-gesture, his face showing surprise and annoyance at being interrupted during what he considered a necessary disciplinary action. James, who had been halfway to his knees, looked up with confusion and hope. The other palace staff exchanged glances, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Margaret gripped the kitchen doorframe tighter, hardly daring to breathe as she watched the confrontation unfold. "Your Highness," Pemberton said, recovering his composure and offering a slight bow. "I was merely correcting this guard's inappropriate behavior. Palace protocol requires nothing of the sort," George interrupted, stepping forward with confidence that surprised even himself. "Captain Mitchell, please stand at attention." James immediately rose to his full height, relief washing over his face as he snapped into his proper military posture. The other guards nearby straightened as well, sensing the shift in power dynamics that was taking place before their eyes. Pemberton's face had turned an alarming shade of red. In his decades of service to the royal family, no one had ever challenged his authority so directly, especially not in front of the household staff. He had grown accustomed to operating with complete autonomy in matters of palace discipline and protocol. "Your Highness, with all due respect," Pemberton began, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You are young, and perhaps do not fully understand the traditions that govern our institution. These guards must learn their place in the hierarchy. Discipline and humility are essential. What I understand," George cut him off again, "is that Captain Mitchell has served our family faithfully for 15 years. I've observed his conduct and I've seen nothing but professionalism and dedication. What I've also observed is a pattern of unnecessary humiliation that serves no purpose other than to satisfy someone's need for power." The corridor had grown, completely silent except for the ticking of an ornate grandfather clock. Even the usually bustling sounds from the kitchen had stopped as staff members strained to hear every word of this unprecedented exchange. James felt his heart pounding as he realized that the prince was not only defending him but was doing so with knowledge of his service record and character. It meant that George had been paying attention, had been watching the unfair treatment, and had chosen this moment to act. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. In her 20 years at the palace, she had never seen anyone stand up to Pemberton's bullying tactics. The fact that it was the young prince himself made the moment even more powerful. Furthermore, George continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I fail to see how forcing a decorated soldier to kneel in front of tourists and staff serves the dignity of the crown. If anything, it diminishes the respect these men and women have earned through their service." Pemberton's jaw tightened as he realized that his authority was being systematically dismantled in front of numerous witnesses. He had built his career on maintaining strict control over palace operations, and this public challenge threatened everything he had worked to establish. "Your Highness, I must protest," Pemberton said, his voice becoming more formal and cold. "The chain of command exists for a reason. These protocols have been in place for generations. Your grandmother, Her Majesty, has always supported the traditional methods of maintaining order within the palace walls." George stepped closer to the advisor, and despite being younger and less experienced, his royal bearing was unmistakable. "Then perhaps it's time for some traditions to evolve. Respect is earned through leadership and fairness, not through humiliation and abuse of power." The word abuse hung in the air like a challenge. Several of the younger palace staff nodded slightly, finding courage in the prince's bold stance. They had all witnessed or heard stories about Pemberton's harsh treatment of employees, but none had ever dared to speak against it. James watched in amazement as the prince continued to defend not just him, but all the staff members who had suffered under Pemberton's regime. The guard's military training had taught him about leadership, and he recognized it clearly in George's actions. This was not just a spoiled royal throwing his weight around. This was genuine moral courage. "I'm ordering you to cease this behavior immediately," George declared, his voice carrying the full weight of his royal authority. "Captain Mitchell and all other members of our household staff will be treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Any future disciplinary actions will be discussed with me first." Pemberton's face had gone from red to pale as the implications of the prince's words sank in. He was being publicly stripped of his authority over staff discipline, and there were too many witnesses for him to deny or minimize what had just occurred. "Your Highness," Pemberton said carefully, "I think you may come to regret this decision. Running a palace requires firm leadership and clear hierarchies. Without proper discipline, chaos will follow. What I regret," George replied firmly, "is that this behavior has been allowed to continue for so long. True leadership inspires loyalty through respect, not fear." The young prince then did something that shocked everyone present. He walked directly to James and extended his hand for a handshake. "Captain Mitchell, I want to personally thank you for your years of dedicated service to our family. Your professionalism under difficult circumstances has not gone unnoticed." James, fighting back emotion, grasped the prince's hand firmly. "Thank you, Your Highness." "It's been my honor to serve." The handshake lasted several seconds, during which the entire corridor remained silent. When it ended, George turned to address the gathered staff members who had been watching the exchange. "I want all of you to know that your service is valued and appreciated. Each of you plays an important role in maintaining the dignity and function of this institution. You deserve to be treated with respect, and I will personally ensure that happens going forward." Margaret wiped away a tear as she watched the young prince address the staff with such sincerity and conviction. Around her, other employees smiled for the first time in weeks. The atmosphere in the corridor had completely changed, transformed from one of tension and fear to one of hope and renewed purpose. Pemberton stood motionless, realizing that his reign of intimidation had come to an abrupt end. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably, and everyone present knew that palace life would never be the same again. The hours following the confrontation passed like a storm brewing on the horizon. Word of Prince George's intervention spread through the palace corridors faster than wildfire, carried by whispered conversations between staff members who could hardly believe what they had witnessed. For the first time in years, there was a sense of hope among the household employees, but also an undercurrent of anxiety about what would come next. Lord Pemberton had retreated to his private office, a lavishly decorated room overlooking the palace gardens. The space reflected his personality perfectly. Dark wood panels, heavy curtains, and portraits of stern-faced aristocrats from centuries past. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his fingers drumming against its polished surface as he contemplated his next move. The advisor was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. His entire identity was built around maintaining control and projecting authority. The public humiliation he had just endured was not something he could simply overlook or forgive. As he stared out at the perfectly manicured gardens, his mind was already working on ways to regain the upper hand. Meanwhile, Captain James Mitchell found himself in an unusual position. His fellow guards approached him throughout the afternoon, offering congratulations and expressing their admiration for Prince George's actions. For the first time in weeks, James felt like he could breathe freely. The constant anxiety about when the next humiliation would come had lifted from his shoulders. "You lucky devil," said Sergeant Williams, a veteran guard who had served alongside James for over a decade. "I've never seen anything like that." The prince really put Pemberton in his place. James nodded, still processing everything that had happened. "I just hope this doesn't make things worse in the long run. Pemberton isn't the type to forget something like this." His concerns proved to be well-founded. By evening, subtle changes began to appear in the palace routine. Guards noticed that their duty assignments had been mysteriously altered, with James being reassigned to less visible positions. The official reason given was operational efficiency, but everyone understood the real motivation. Margaret Thompson observed these changes with growing concern as she prepared dinner in the palace kitchens. She had worked in royal households long enough to recognize the signs of administrative revenge. Pemberton might not be able to openly challenge Prince George, but he still controlled many aspects of palace operations. "He's trying to make James invisible," Margaret confided to her assistant cook, Sarah, as they prepared vegetables for the evening meal, "moving him away from any position where the prince might see him again." Sarah, a young woman who had only recently started working at the palace, looked confused. "But why? I thought the prince made it clear that the bullying had to stop." Margaret sighed as she stirred a large pot of soup. "Oh, my dear girl, you have so much to learn about how things really work around here. Men like Pemberton don't give up power easily. They just find new ways to exercise it." The truth of Margaret's words became apparent over the next several days. While there were no more public displays of forced kneeling, Pemberton had begun implementing what he called efficiency measures that seemed designed to make life difficult. For anyone who had witnessed or supported the prince's intervention, James found himself assigned to overnight shifts at remote entrances where he would have no contact with royal family members or important visitors. His meal breaks were scheduled at odd hours when the dining areas were nearly empty. Even his uniform inspections became more frequent and more rigorous, with minor infractions being noted in his personnel file. Other staff members who had been present during the confrontation experienced similar treatment. Margaret's kitchen supply requests began experiencing delays, forcing her to work with limited ingredients. Sarah was assigned to cleaning duties in unused portions of the palace, far from the main activity centers where she might encounter anyone of importance. Prince George, however, was not oblivious to these developments. Despite his youth, he possessed a keen understanding of human nature and organizational dynamics. He had spent enough time observing palace operations to recognize when normal routines were being manipulated for personal reasons. During his morning walks through the palace grounds, George made it a point to visit different areas and speak with various staff members. These informal conversations revealed the pattern of subtle retaliation that was taking place. The prince realized that his initial intervention, while necessary, had only addressed the most visible symptoms of a deeper problem. One afternoon, George encountered James during one of his remote assignments at a side entrance rarely used by anyone of importance. The guard was surprised to see the prince in such an out-of-the-way location. "Good afternoon, Captain Mitchell," George said warmly. "How are you finding your new duties?" James hesitated, unsure how much he should reveal about his situation. His military training emphasized respect for the chain of command, even when that chain was being manipulated unfairly. "The duties are fine, Your Highness," James replied diplomatically. "I serve wherever I'm needed most." George studied the guard's face, noting the careful neutrality in his expression. "I trust you're being treated fairly? No more of those unnecessary displays of authority?" "No, Your Highness. Nothing like that has occurred since our last encounter." The prince nodded thoughtfully. While James's answer was technically truthful, George could sense the unspoken frustration behind the formal response. The systematic reassignment of duties was just as much a form of punishment as the public humiliation had been, perhaps even more insidious because it was harder to challenge directly. "Captain, I want you to know that your service continues to be valued, regardless of where your duties take you," George said meaningfully, "and I want you to know that you can always approach me directly if any issues arise that concern you." James felt a surge of gratitude at the prince's words. Even if he couldn't openly complain about his treatment, It was comforting to know that someone in authority was paying attention and cared about his welfare. That evening, George requested a private meeting with his private secretary, Lady Catherine Hartwell, a sharp-minded woman in her 50s who had served the royal family for decades. Catherine was known for her discretion, her political acumen, and her ability to navigate the complex web of palace relationships. "Catherine," George began as they sat in his private study, "I need your honest assessment of the current situation with Lord Pemberton and the household staff." Lady Catherine had been expecting this conversation. She had her own network of contacts throughout the palace, and she was well aware of the ongoing power struggle between the prince and the chief advisor. "Your Highness," she said carefully, "your intervention on Captain Mitchell's behalf was both admirable and necessary. However, I believe you should be prepared for a more sustained campaign of resistance from Lord Pemberton. He sees your actions as a direct challenge to his authority, and men in his position rarely accept such challenges quietly." George leaned forward, his expression serious. "What exactly are you suggesting might happen?" "He cannot openly defy you, of course, but he has many tools at his disposal for making life difficult for those he perceives as threats or obstacles. What you've seen so far is likely just the beginning. He may also attempt to undermine your position with other family members by suggesting that your youth and inexperience make you unsuitable for involvement in palace administration." The prince absorbed this information thoughtfully. He had initiated this confrontation based on principle, but he was beginning to understand that winning a single battle was very different from winning an entire war. The challenge now was figuring out how to protect the people he had defended, while also establishing his own authority within the palace hierarchy. As night fell over the palace grounds, the various players in this unfolding drama prepared for what they sensed would be an escalating conflict over power, respect, and the future direction of royal household management. 3 weeks after the corridor confrontation, the palace had settled into an uneasy tension that everyone could feel, but nobody dared discuss openly. Lord Pemberton had indeed escalated his campaign, but with the calculated precision of a chess master, rather than the obvious brutality he had previously employed. His new approach was far more dangerous because it operated within the gray areas of palace protocol, making it nearly impossible to challenge directly. The breaking point came during preparations for a state visit from the Prime Minister of Canada. These high-profile events required coordination between multiple departments, and Pemberton had positioned himself as the central figure overseeing every detail. It was during one of these planning meetings that he made his most calculated move yet. Prince George had requested to attend the coordination meeting, wanting to learn more about the diplomatic aspects of royal duties. The meeting was held in the Queen's private conference room, an intimate space reserved for the most important palace business. Present were Pemberton, Lady Catherine Hartwell, the head of security, and several senior staff members. "Your Highness," Pemberton began with exaggerated formality, "while we appreciate your interest in these proceedings, I must express some concerns about recent irregularities in palace operations." George felt his jaw tighten, recognizing immediately that this was not going to be a simple briefing about the Canadian visit. Lady Catherine shot him a warning glance, silently advising caution. "What irregularities are you referring to, Lord Pemberton?" George asked evenly. The advisor opened a leather folder and withdrew several documents. "I've been conducting a review of household staff performance, as is my responsibility. I've discovered some troubling patterns that I believe require your attention." He slid a paper across the polished conference table. George picked it up and saw that it was a detailed report about Captain James Mitchell, filled with minor infractions and performance concerns that had supposedly been documented over recent weeks. "According to this report," Pemberton continued, "Captain Mitchell has shown declining punctuality, uniform violations, and questionable judgment in his interactions with palace visitors. I'm afraid his behavior has deteriorated significantly since he began receiving special attention from certain quarters." The implication was clear and insulting. Pemberton was suggesting that George's defense of James had somehow corrupted the guard's performance and discipline. Several of the other attendees shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the political minefield that was opening up before them. George studied the document carefully, noting dates and times for various alleged infractions. His knowledge of palace operations told him that many of these incidents would be impossible to verify, consisting mainly of subjective assessments of attitude and demeanor. "These are serious allegations," George said diplomatically. "Have you discussed these concerns with Captain Mitchell directly?" "I have attempted to address these issues through proper channels," Pemberton replied smugly. "However, I fear that previous interventions have created an atmosphere where normal disciplinary procedures are no longer effective." Lady Catherine recognized the trap that was being set. Pemberton was forcing the prince into an impossible position: either abandon his support for James Mitchell or appear to be interfering with legitimate administrative procedures. Either choice would damage George's credibility and authority. "Perhaps," Lady Catherine interjected smoothly, "we could table this discussion until after the Canadian visit. These operational matters might be better addressed when we're not focused on such an important diplomatic event." But Pemberton was not willing to let his advantage slip away. "With respect, Lady Catherine, I believe these matters require immediate attention. The Canadian Prime Minister will be accompanied by significant media coverage, and we cannot afford to have unreliable personnel in visible positions during such a critical time." George felt the weight of everyone's attention as they waited to see how he would respond. He understood that this moment would define not just James Mitchell's fate, but his own future ability to influence palace operations. If he backed down now, Pemberton would essentially have free rein to continue his bullying tactics with other staff members. "Lord Pemberton," George said carefully, "I appreciate your diligence in monitoring staff performance. However, I would like to conduct my own review of these allegations before any disciplinary actions are taken." The advisor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your Highness, while your interest is commendable, personnel management requires specific expertise and experience. These decisions affect the security and reputation of the entire royal household, which is exactly why they deserve thorough consideration," George replied firmly. "I'm not questioning your expertise, but I am insisting on a comprehensive evaluation before we potentially ruin a good man's career based on what appears to be a collection of minor and subjective complaints." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing a fundamental power struggle that would have consequences far beyond the fate of one palace guard. Pemberton straightened in his chair, his voice taking on a tone of barely controlled frustration. "Your Highness, I must remind you that I have been managing palace operations since before you were born. The smooth functioning of this institution depends on maintaining proper authority structures. When those structures are undermined, chaos inevitably follows." "And I must remind you," George responded with quiet intensity, "that this institution exists to serve the people of our nation, not to provide a playground for petty tyrants who mistake cruelty for leadership." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Several attendees drew sharp breaths, recognizing that the conflict had just escalated to a level that would be difficult to walk back from. Pemberton's face had gone completely white, then flushed deep red as the full impact of the prince's statement sank in. Lady Catherine quickly stepped in before the situation could deteriorate further. "Perhaps we should focus on the Canadian visit preparations for now," she suggested diplomatically. "These other matters can certainly be addressed through proper channels at an appropriate time." But the damage was already done. Everyone in the room understood that a line had been crossed, and the careful balance of palace politics had been permanently altered. Pemberton had overplayed his hand by trying to force a public confrontation, and George had responded with a directness that left no doubt about his position. As the meeting continued with discussions of security arrangements and ceremonial protocols, both men maintained professional facades while mentally preparing for the next phase of their conflict. James Mitchell's fate had become secondary to the larger question of who would ultimately control the daily operations of the royal household. When the meeting finally ended, Pemberton gathered his papers with deliberate precision, his movements sharp with suppressed anger. As he prepared to leave, he turned to address the prince one final time. "Your Highness," he said with cold formality, "I hope you will not come to regret the path you have chosen. The responsibilities of leadership often require making difficult decisions that may seem harsh to those without experience in such matters." George met his gaze steadily. "Lord Pemberton, the only thing I regret is that it took so long for someone to challenge behavior that should never have been tolerated in the first place." As the advisor left the conference room, Lady Catherine remained behind to speak privately with the prince. Her expression was a mixture of admiration and concern. "Your Highness," she said quietly, "you handled that with remarkable composure, but you should understand that this conflict is far from over. Pemberton has considerable influence throughout the palace, and he will not accept this public humiliation without retaliation." George nodded thoughtfully. "I understand, Catherine. But sometimes the right thing to do is also the difficult thing to do. If we don't stand up to bullies when we have the power to do so, we become complicit in their actions." Outside in the corridors, word of the heated exchange was already beginning to spread among the staff. The battle lines had been drawn, and everyone in the palace would soon be forced to choose sides in a conflict that would determine the future culture and character of the royal household. The Canadian state visit arrived under a cloud of tension that permeated every corner of the palace. Despite the underlying conflict between Prince George and Lord Pemberton, the event proceeded with the flawless precision that centuries of royal protocol had perfected. However, beneath the polished surface, a careful observer would have noticed the subtle signs of the ongoing power struggle. Captain James Mitchell had been assigned to security duty at the furthest perimeter of the palace grounds, effectively ensuring that he would have no contact with the visiting dignitaries or media coverage. His fellow guards understood the significance of this placement. Recognizing it as another example of Pemberton's systematic retaliation, Margaret Thompson worked longer hours than usual, preparing elaborate meals for the extended guest list while dealing with continued supply delays that made her job unnecessarily difficult. Despite these challenges, her professionalism never wavered. Though the stress was clearly taking its toll on the veteran cook, Prince George moved through his ceremonial duties with apparent ease. But Lady Catherine noticed the subtle signs of strain around his eyes. The weight of challenging such an established figure in palace hierarchy was considerable, especially for someone so young and still learning the intricacies of royal responsibility. The turning point came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a retired palace physician who had served the royal family for over 30 years, had been invited to attend the state dinner as a gesture of appreciation for her long service. Dr. Warren was known for her sharp intellect and her unwavering commitment to truth, qualities that had served her well during her medical career. During the cocktail reception preceding the formal dinner, Dr. Warren found herself in conversation with several palace staff members who were working the event. Her trained eye for human behavior allowed her to quickly sense the atmosphere of tension and fear that surrounded interactions with Lord Pemberton. "Something's not right here," she confided to her companion, retired General Sir Robert Hayes, who had also been invited to the dinner. "I've worked in this palace for decades, and I've never seen the staff so on edge around a senior advisor." General Hayes, who had his own experience with military hierarchy and leadership dynamics, had made similar observations. "That Pemberton fellow seems to rule through intimidation rather than respect. It's not healthy for any organization, let alone one representing the crown." Their conversation was interrupted when they witnessed a minor incident near the kitchen entrance. A young server had accidentally spilled a small amount of wine while preparing glasses for service. The mishap was barely noticeable and easily corrected, but Pemberton happened to be passing by at that moment. "Clumsy fool," he hissed at the server, his voice loud enough to carry to nearby guests. "How dare you display such incompetence during such an important event? You'll be written up for this, and if I see another mistake from you tonight, you'll be looking for new employment tomorrow." The young server's face went pale as she stammered an apology, clearly terrified by the advisor's reaction to such a minor accident. Several guests noticed the exchange, their expressions showing discomfort at witnessing such harsh treatment over something so trivial. Dr. Warren's medical instincts kicked in as she observed the server's physical response to the verbal assault. The girl was clearly experiencing symptoms of acute stress and anxiety that went far beyond what would be normal for a minor workplace mistake. This suggested a pattern of ongoing psychological pressure and intimidation. "That's enough," Dr. Warren said firmly, approaching the situation with the authority that came from years of commanding respect in high-pressure medical situations. The young lady made a simple mistake that has already been corrected. "There's no need for such harsh criticism." Pemberton turned toward her with surprise and irritation. "Dr. Warren, while I appreciate your concern, staff discipline is not within your area of expertise. These matters are handled according to established palace protocols." "Actually," the retired physician replied calmly, Recognizing signs of psychological distress is very much within my area of expertise. And what I'm seeing here suggests a pattern of behavior that is neither healthy nor appropriate for a workplace environment. The exchange was taking place within earshot of several important guests, including members of the Canadian delegation. Prince George, who had been greeting visitors across the room, noticed the commotion and began moving toward the group. General Hayes stepped forward to support Dr. Warren's position. I've commanded thousands of soldiers in my career, and I can tell you that effective leadership never requires humiliating subordinates over minor mistakes. What I just witnessed was bullying, plain and simple. By this time, Prince George had reached the group along with Lady Catherine and several other palace officials. The presence of so many witnesses, including foreign dignitaries, had created exactly the kind of public incident that Pemberton had been trying to avoid. "Is there a problem here?" George asked diplomatically, though his eyes revealed his understanding of the situation. Dr. Warren, emboldened by the support of General Hayes and motivated by her concern for the staff, decided to speak openly about what she had observed. "Your Highness, I believe there is indeed a problem. Over the past several hours, I've witnessed behavior that suggests a systematic pattern of intimidation and abuse directed toward palace staff members." Pemberton's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Dr. Warren is overstepping her bounds," he said stiffly. "These matters are internal palace business and should not be discussed in front of guests." But Dr. Warren was not finished. Her years of medical practice had taught her to be thorough in her observations and decisive in her actions when people's well-being was at stake. "Your Highness," she continued with professional composure, "I have observed multiple staff members displaying clear signs of chronic stress and anxiety. The incident I just witnessed was not an isolated case of appropriate supervision. It was part of what appears to be an ongoing campaign of psychological intimidation." General Hayes nodded in agreement. "I concur with Dr. Warren's assessment. What we witnessed was not leadership. It was abuse of power designed to humiliate and control through fear." The Canadian Prime Minister's wife, who had been standing nearby during the entire exchange, looked visibly uncomfortable. Other distinguished guests were beginning to take notice of the unusual confrontation, creating exactly the kind of diplomatic embarrassment that palace protocol was designed to prevent. Lady Catherine recognized the critical nature of the moment. The conflict that had been simmering beneath the surface was now erupting in the most public possible venue, with foreign dignitaries as witnesses. The reputation of the royal household was at stake. "Perhaps," Lady Catherine suggested diplomatically, "we should continue this discussion in a more private setting after our guests have been properly received." But Prince George had reached his breaking point. The combination of Dr. Warren's professional assessment, General Hayes's military perspective, and his own accumulated observations had crystallized his understanding of the situation. He could no longer allow diplomatic courtesy to overshadow moral responsibility. "No, Catherine," George said firmly. "These concerns are too serious to be postponed or handled behind closed doors. Dr. Warren and General Hayes are respected professionals whose observations carry significant weight." He turned to address Pemberton directly, his voice carrying the full authority of his royal position. "Lord Pemberton, you are suspended from your duties effective immediately. Lady Catherine will assume your responsibilities until a full investigation can be conducted." The announcement sent shockwaves through the assembled group. Several guests exchanged glances, unsure whether they were witnessing a dramatic moment in royal history or an uncomfortable family dispute that they should pretend not to notice. Pemberton's face had gone through several color changes, finally settling on a pale shade that suggested both shock and fury. "Your Highness, this is highly irregular. You cannot simply dismiss a senior advisor based on the opinions of retired staff members who lack understanding of current palace operations." "Actually," George replied calmly, "I can, and I have. Furthermore, this decision is not based solely on tonight's observations. It's based on weeks of documented incidents, staff complaints, and a pattern of behavior that is inconsistent with the values this institution represents." Dr. Warren felt a surge of pride watching the young prince take such a principled stand. She had known him since he was a child, and seeing him demonstrate such moral courage in a difficult situation filled her with hope for the future of the monarchy. Margaret Thompson, who had been watching the confrontation from the kitchen doorway, felt tears of relief streaming down her face. For weeks she had watched good people suffer under Pemberton's reign of intimidation, feeling powerless to help them. Now finally, someone with the authority to act had chosen to do the right thing. Captain James Mitchell, stationed at his remote post on the palace perimeter, was unaware of the dramatic events unfolding inside. He continued his duties with the professionalism that had characterized his entire career, not knowing that his fate was being decided by people who had witnessed the true nature of the system. 6 months had passed since that dramatic evening during the Canadian state visit, and the transformation within the palace walls was remarkable. The formal investigation into Lord Pemberton's conduct had revealed a pattern of abuse that extended far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. Dozens of current and former staff members had come forward with testimonies of intimidation, unfair treatment, and psychological harassment that had been systematically covered up or ignored. Captain James Mitchell stood once again in the grand corridor where his ordeal had begun, but this time he wore the insignia of a newly promoted security chief. Prince George had personally recommended him for the position, citing his integrity, professionalism, and ability to maintain dignity under pressure as exactly the qualities needed for palace leadership. The promotion had been more than just a vindication of James's character. It represented a fundamental shift in how the palace valued its employees. Merit, dedication, and moral character had replaced political maneuvering and fear-based compliance as the primary criteria for advancement. Margaret Thompson bustled through the kitchen with renewed energy, her face bearing the smile that had returned after months of stress and anxiety. Her supply requests were now processed efficiently, and she had been given additional staff to help manage her workload. More importantly, she had been invited to participate in menu planning meetings, her expertise finally receiving the recognition it deserved. "It's like working in a completely different place," Margaret confided to Sarah, who had also benefited from the palace's cultural transformation. The young woman had been promoted to assistant supervisor and was thriving in an environment that encouraged growth rather than fear. Prince George had matured visibly during the months following the crisis. The experience of standing up to Pemberton and dealing with the aftermath had taught him valuable lessons about leadership, responsibility, and the courage required to do what is right rather than what is convenient. His confidence had grown, but so had his humility as he learned about the complex challenges of managing a large organization. Lady Catherine had proven herself exceptionally capable in her expanded role as chief administrator. Her approach to staff management was based on respect, clear communication, and fair treatment, creating an atmosphere where people felt valued and motivated to do their best work. She had implemented new policies for addressing workplace complaints and established regular meetings with staff representatives to ensure that problems were identified and resolved quickly. The investigation into Pemberton's conduct had been thorough and damaging. Dr. Warren and General Hayes had provided crucial external validation for the staff complaints, lending credibility to accusations that might otherwise have been dismissed as disgruntled employee grievances. The final report detailed years of systematic abuse, favoritism, and retaliation that had created a toxic work environment affecting hundreds of people. Pemberton himself had been quietly dismissed from royal service, his departure announced simply as a retirement due to personal reasons. The royal family's natural discretion prevented public disclosure of the full extent of his misconduct, but word had spread through appropriate channels within aristocratic circles. His reputation was permanently damaged, and his prospects for similar positions elsewhere were effectively eliminated. The changes extended far beyond personnel matters. Prince George had insisted on implementing new training programs for all supervisory staff, focusing on leadership skills, conflict resolution, and workplace respect. He had also established an independent ombudsman position to handle employee complaints, ensuring that future problems would not be buried under layers of bureaucracy and intimidation. One afternoon, as Prince George walked through the palace corridors on his regular informal visits with staff members, he encountered James at his security post near the main entrance. The transformation in the man's bearing was striking. The tension and anxiety that had marked their earlier interactions had been replaced by confidence and professional pride. "Good afternoon, Chief Mitchell," George said warmly. using the new title that still brought a smile to James's face. "Good afternoon, Your Highness. All quiet on the security front today. I'm glad to hear it. How are you finding your new responsibilities?" James straightened slightly, his expression serious but no longer fearful. "Challenging but rewarding, Your Highness. I'm working hard to build the kind of security team that reflects the values you've established for the palace. Respect, professionalism, and dignity for everyone." George nodded approvingly. "Those are exactly the right priorities. And how is your family adjusting to the changes?" "Very well, sir. My wife says I'm a different person at home now. Less stressed, more confident. My children are proud to tell their friends that their father works at the palace again." The prince felt a deep satisfaction hearing these words. The personal cost of his confrontation with Pemberton had been significant, but moments like this confirmed that he had made the right choice. The ripple effects of standing up for one person had improved the lives of countless others. Dr. Warren had become a regular visitor to the palace, serving as an informal advisor on staff welfare issues. Her medical expertise and objective perspective continued to provide valuable insights into the psychological aspects of workplace management. She had also become something of a legend among the staff, admired for her courage in speaking up during that crucial evening. "Your Highness," she had told George during one of their meetings, "what you did that night was more than just standing up to a bully. You demonstrated that true leadership requires the courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves. That lesson will serve you well throughout your life." General Hayes had also maintained his connection to the palace, occasionally attending events and serving as a sounding board for security and administrative matters. His military experience had proven invaluable in helping to restructure the palace hierarchy. Along more efficient and humane lines, the Canadian Prime Minister had later privately commended Prince George for his handling of the situation, noting that witnessing his principled stance had actually increased international respect for the British royal family. The incident had demonstrated that the monarchy was capable of evolution and self-correction, qualities that were essential for maintaining relevance in the modern world. As the months passed, other positive changes continued to emerge. Staff turnover decreased dramatically as people no longer felt the need to escape an oppressive work environment. Productivity increased as employees felt more engaged and valued. Most importantly, a culture of mutual respect had replaced the atmosphere of fear and intimidation that had previously characterized palace operations. Prince George often reflected on the lessons he had learned during those difficult months. The experience had taught him that leadership was not about commanding obedience through fear or intimidation, but about inspiring others through example and creating an environment where people could do their best work while maintaining their dignity and self-respect. The transformation was perhaps most visible during special events and state visits, when the palace staff worked with renewed enthusiasm and pride. Visitors frequently commented on the warm, professional atmosphere and the obvious dedication of the household employees. On the anniversary of the confrontation that had started it all, Prince George made a point of personally thanking each of the staff members who had been affected by Pemberton's behavior. He presented James Mitchell with a special commendation for his service and resilience, and he gave Margaret Thompson a formal recognition for her years of dedicated work in the palace kitchens. "Your courage in enduring unfair treatment while maintaining your professionalism and dignity serves as an inspiration to all of us," George told the assembled group. "You reminded me that the true measure of any institution is how it treats the people who serve it faithfully every day." As the ceremony concluded and people returned to their duties, there was a sense of completion and new beginnings. The palace had emerged from a dark period stronger and more unified, with a clear commitment to the principles of respect, fairness, and human dignity that would guide it into the future. The young prince who had once intervened to prevent a guard from being forced to kneel had grown into a leader who understood that true authority comes not from demanding submission, but from earning respect through consistent demonstration of moral courage and genuine care for others. The lessons learned during those challenging months would serve him well throughout his life, and the positive changes he had championed would continue to benefit the palace community for generations to come.